Mark and Claire had been married for 10 years, but their marriage had grown stale. Mark buried himself in work, while Claire turned to faith to fill the emotional void. One Sunday, Claire urged Mark to join her at church, hoping it might rekindle their connection. Mark reluctantly agreed, stepping into a place he hadn't visited in years. As the service began, Mark's attention drifted, his gaze landing on a young nun seated near the altar. Her presence was striking, not in an overtly attractive way, but her gentle demeanor and bright smile caught his eye. She was Sister Cecilia, newly assigned to the church. Throughout the sermon, their eyes met briefly, and Mark felt a spark of curiosity he couldn't explain. After the service, Claire introduced Mark to some members of the congregation, including Cecilia. Her voice was soft yet confident, and she greeted Mark with a warm smile. He noticed her eyes lingered just a second longer than expected as they spoke about mundane topics, church events, and community projects. Mark felt an odd pull, a connection he hadn't felt in years. That night, he couldn't shake the memory of her face, and something inside him stirred, a longing he didn't yet understand. The following Sunday, Mark attended church again, this time under the guise of supporting Claire, though, in truth, he was eager to see Cecilia. His heart quickened when the priest announced that volunteers were needed to help with church repairs and that Cecilia would be overseeing the projects. Mark immediately offered to assist. When he arrived at the church the next day, he found Cecilia waiting by the entrance, holding a toolbox. She greeted him warmly, and they began working on fixing an old pew together. As they worked side by side, their conversation flowed naturally. Mark talked about his job as an architect and how he loved bringing new life to old structures. Cecilia listened intently, her eyes lighting up with genuine interest. In turn, she shared stories about her life before taking her vows, revealing a love for art and literature. Mark was surprised by her wit and humor, traits he didn't associate with someone in religious life. As the hours passed, their interactions grew more playful, and Mark found himself laughing, a sound that had been missing from his life for a long time. When the work was done, Mark left the church feeling lighter, though he couldn't ignore the growing fascination he felt for the young nun. Mark began finding excuses to spend time at the church, whether it was fixing another broken item or helping with upcoming events, ensuring his path crossed with Cecilia. Over time, their conversations became less formal and more personal. Mark teased Cecilia about her penchant for getting paint on her hands during projects, and she quipped back with clever retorts, her laughter ringing through the church halls. During one particularly warm afternoon, they painted a fence together, sharing stories about their lives. Mark spoke about his struggles in his marriage while carefully avoiding criticizing Claire directly. Cecilia opened up about the challenges of religious life, admitting she sometimes missed the freedom of her pre-con days. Their interactions were innocent on the surface, but had undeniable undertones of connection. Mark began noticing how Cecilia's eyes lingered on him more often, while she found herself looking forward to his visits, her heart fluttering whenever he entered the room. They exchanged subtle compliments. Their words were laced with double meanings, though neither acknowledged it aloud. A quiet understanding was forming between them, a dangerous chemistry that blurred the line between friendship and something much deeper. One rainy afternoon, as Mark finished fixing a squeaky door in the church, Cecilia invited him to join her for tea in the rectory. At first, their conversation stayed light, focused on the church's renovation plans and Mark's architectural ideas. But as the rain poured outside, the mood shifted. Mark spoke about the growing emptiness in his marriage, revealing how Claire's increasing devotion to her faith made him feel more like a distant spectator in his own home. "I don't even know if she sees me anymore," he admitted, his voice tinged with frustration and sadness. Cecilia listened intently, her heart aching for him in a way she couldn't fully explain. In turn, Cecilia shared her struggles with her faith. "I thought I was certain when I took my vows," she said softly, staring into her tea. "But there are days I wonder if I made the right choice." Her vulnerability caught Mark off guard. He reached out instinctively, his hand brushing hers. Though the touch was brief, it sent a jolt through them both. For the first time, they acknowledged their loneliness to each other. Their shared confessions created a bond that neither could deny, even as they both felt the weight of guilt beginning to press down. In the days that followed, Mark found himself thinking of Cecilia constantly. Her laughter, her voice, the way her eyes lit up when she smiled. All of it consumed his thoughts. He began inventing reasons to visit the church more frequently, always hoping to catch a glimpse of her. Cecilia, too, found herself drawn to Mark in ways she hadn't experienced before. She prayed for strength, yet her heart betrayed her, quickening at the mere thought of him. She chastised herself for the feelings she was developing, but couldn't resist the pull of his presence. One afternoon, while organizing hymns together, their hands accidentally brushed again. This time, neither pulled away. Immediately, their eyes met, and the unspoken connection between them hung heavy in the air. Cecilia quickly looked away, her cheeks flushing, but the moment lingered in both their minds. Despite their growing feelings, they tried to maintain the facade of innocence, yet every interaction became charged with unspoken emotion. Their shared laughter carried an undercurrent of longing, and even the simplest gestures, a smile or a glance, held a depth that left them both reeling. Temptation was no longer a distant shadow. It had taken root in their hearts, and they both knew it. The line between friendship and something more blurred further. One quiet evening, Mark stayed late at the church to help Cecilia organize supplies for an upcoming charity event. The dim lighting and the soft hum of their conversation created an atmosphere that felt almost intimate. As they worked side by side, their movements slowed and their proximity narrowed. At one point, Cecilia reached for a box just as Mark did. Their hands met. This time, neither made an effort to pull away. Mark turned to face her, his expression conflicted, yet intense. "Cecilia," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. Cecilia felt her breath hitch as she looked into his eyes. "Mark, we can't," she murmured, but her voice lacked conviction. The weight of their emotions pressed down on them, and for a brief moment, the world outside seemed to vanish. Suddenly, Cecilia stepped back, her heart pounding. "I think you should go," she said, her voice shaky. Mark hesitated. Pain flickered across his face, but he nodded and left without another word. That night, neither of them could sleep. Their thoughts were consumed by the forbidden connection that had begun to unravel their carefully constructed lives. The weeks passed, and the tension between Mark and Cecilia grew unbearable. They tried to maintain boundaries, but their connection seemed to defy reason. Late one evening, after a community meeting at the church, Mark found Cecilia sitting alone in the garden. The moonlight bathed her face, and she looked serene yet deeply troubled. "Cecilia," Mark said softly as he approached. She turned to him, her expression unreadable. "I can't stop thinking about you," he admitted, his voice trembling. Cecilia's heart pounded in her chest. "Mark, what we feel, it's wrong," she whispered, though her voice wavered with doubt. Mark sat beside her, closer than he should have, their knees nearly touching. "It doesn't feel wrong to me," he said. "It feels real. It feels like I'm finally alive." Cecilia looked away, tears brimming in her eyes. "I've taken vows," she said, her voice breaking. "I've committed myself to God, but you make me question everything." In the charged silence that followed, Mark reached out and gently touched her cheek. She didn't pull away. Instead, she closed her eyes, And in that moment, all their resistance crumbled. Mark leaned in, and their lips met in a tender, hesitant kiss. When they pulled apart, both were breathless, their emotions a chaotic whirlwind. "What have we done?" Cecilia whispered, her hand trembling against her lips, but neither could deny that their lives had just changed forever. After their first kiss, both Mark and Cecilia were overwhelmed by guilt and confusion. They avoided each other for days, hoping that distance might quell the feelings they couldn't control. But the more they tried to stay apart, the more they longed for one another. Mark began to rationalize his actions. He told himself that his marriage to Claire was already broken, and that Cecilia was the only person who truly understood him. Cecilia, however, was trapped in an emotional tug of war. She prayed fervently for clarity, but her feelings for Mark grew stronger with each passing day. Inevitably, their paths crossed again during another church project. This time, the tension between them was palpable. They worked in silence, their hands brushing occasionally, sending jolts of electricity through them both. Finally, Mark couldn't bear it any longer. "We can't pretend this isn't happening," he said quietly. Cecilia looked at him, her eyes filled with anguish. "Mark, I don't know what to do," she admitted. They began meeting in secret, finding solace in stolen moments and whispered conversations. Every glance, every touch, every word became a dangerous dance of longing and restraint. Their connection deepened even as they both knew the risks were growing with every passing day. One evening, Mark suggested they visit a secluded cabin owned by a friend of his, claiming it would give them a quiet space to discuss their feelings. Cecilia hesitated, but ultimately agreed, her heart torn between fear and an irresistible pull toward Mark. The cabin was small and cozy, nestled in the woods. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow across the room. At first, their conversation was stilted, filled with confessions of guilt and uncertainty. "I've never felt this way about anyone," Mark admitted, his voice raw. "Not even Claire." Cecilia's eyes filled with tears. "I feel the same," she said. "But what we're doing, it's a sin," though her voice lacked conviction. As the night wore on, the walls they'd built around themselves crumbled. Mark reached for Cecilia's hand, and she didn't pull away. Their lips met again, this time with more urgency. They surrendered to their emotions, letting their desire consume them. The storm outside mirrored the tempest within them as they spent the night together, lost in each other's arms. When morning came, they lay in silence, both knowing they had crossed a line they could never return from. The morning after their passionate night together, both Mark and Cecilia woke up with a heavy sense of guilt, but also an undeniable feeling of sad satisfaction. Mark, still in a state of disbelief, stared at the ceiling, grappling with the enormity of what they had done. Cecilia, who had always lived by a strict code of faith, was devastated. The vows she had taken now seemed like chains, and yet in Mark's arms, she had felt free. "Mark, we can't keep doing this," Cecilia whispered, her voice trembling. Mark turned to face her, his hand gently touching her cheek. "I know, but I don't want to stop," he confessed. "You make me feel alive, Cecilia. I haven't felt this way in years." Cecilia pulled away, sitting up in the bed. "I'm supposed to belong to God," she said, her voice a mix of sorrow and confusion. "And you? You belong to your wife." Mark's expression darkened. "Do I? I'm not sure what I belong to anymore." The weight of their actions hung between them like a thick fog. Both were trapped, unable to reconcile their feelings with their responsibilities. Mark returned home that day, his mind in turmoil, while Cecilia too struggled with the conflict inside her heart. As the weeks passed, Mark and Cecilia's affair became a tangled web of lies. At home, Mark tried to act like nothing had changed, but he found himself withdrawing from Claire. He spent more late nights at work, and whenever he was home, he seemed distracted and distant. Claire noticed the change but attributed it to stress from his job. Cecilia, too, was living a double life. Her superiors at the convent suspected nothing, but she found herself avoiding certain duties to make time for Mark. She lied about being unwell or needing rest, all while her mind was consumed with thoughts of him. One Sunday, when Mark came to church for what he told Claire was a quick meeting, he and Cecilia exchanged knowing glances from across the room. Every time they spoke to each other, their words were laced with hidden meanings, and the air around them seemed to hum with unspoken tension. Their lives outside of each other felt like a facade, but in their secret meetings, they found a sense of belonging neither had felt in years. The affair, though thrilling, became more dangerous with each passing day. One evening, after Mark had spent yet another late night at church, Claire confronted him about his erratic behavior. Her voice trembled as she asked why he seemed so distant. Mark brushed her off, claiming it was just work stress, but Claire's intuition told her there was more to it. As Claire spent more time reflecting on their marriage, she began to notice the subtle signs of his growing distance. His attention was elsewhere, no longer on her or their life together. She observed his lingering looks at his phone and his sudden nervousness when she entered the room. Meanwhile, Cecilia too began to notice changes in Mark's behavior. He seemed more withdrawn during their meetings, his mind constantly elsewhere. One afternoon, as they shared a quiet moment in the church, Cecilia couldn't help but ask, "Is everything okay? You've been acting strange lately." Mark hesitated, the weight of his lies pressing down on him. "It's nothing," he said. But Cecilia saw the guilt in his eyes. She felt a sharp pang in her chest. Was Mark starting to pull away? Was he growing tired of their affair? A new emotion stirred within her, jealousy. The thought of losing him or him choosing Claire over her ignited a fire she hadn't expected. The passion they shared was no longer just about desire, it was about possession. Claire's suspicions reached their peak when she followed Mark one evening, after he claimed to be working late. She trailed him at a distance as he drove to the church, her heart pounding. She watched as he parked and entered the building. Not for the first time, Claire knew something was off, and now she had confirmation later that night when Mark returned home. Claire confronted him with what she had seen. "I know where you've been, Mark," she said coldly, her voice steady but laced with hurt. "You're spending all this time with her, aren't you?" Mark froze, guilt washing over him. "Claire, he began, but she interrupted him. "Don't lie to me," she said sharply. "I know. I've seen the way you look at her, the way you act like she's the only person who matters." "Tell me I'm wrong." Mark opened his mouth, but no words came out. He realized that the lies and deception had gone too far. His affair with Cecilia was no longer a secret, and Claire was no longer willing to pretend she didn't know. Meanwhile, Cecilia, oblivious to the storm Mark was facing at home, felt the walls of their relationship tightening. The guilt, the fear of exposure, and the weight of their actions were becoming unbearable. Claire's confrontation left Mark shattered, but the truth was now out in the open. He tried to explain, to justify his actions, but his words fell short. "It's not like that," he pleaded. "I didn't mean to hurt you. It just happened." Claire stared at him, her eyes filled with betrayal. "So it's her? It's Cecilia, isn't it? I knew something was wrong, Mark. I saw the way you looked at her, the way you changed around her." Mark nodded slowly, his voice hoarse. "I didn't want this to happen. But she's different. She understands me in a way no one else does. I didn't mean to fall in love with her." Claire stepped back, her face pale. "Love? Is that what this is? After all we've been through, You throw it all away for someone else? The pain in her voice cut Mark to the core. He realized too late that he had destroyed everything. Meanwhile, Cecilia received a letter from the convent superiors. It was a summons to meet with the abbess. The affair was no longer a secret there either, and Cecilia's world was beginning to unravel. Her meeting with the abbess was long and filled with shame. The abbess, a stern woman who had known Cecilia since her arrival at the convent, sat across from her with a disappointed look. "You have violated your vows, Sister Cecilia. Your actions have betrayed the very foundation of your calling." Cecilia bowed her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I am so sorry. I never meant for this to happen. I never wanted to hurt anyone." The abbess sighed deeply, her gaze softened slightly. "You must understand that this is not just about you and Mark. This is about the trust you've broken, not only with the church, but with yourself. You have let worldly desires lead you astray." Cecilia felt the weight of her guilt pressing down on her, and yet part of her still yearned for Mark, for the love and connection she had found in his arms. But she knew that the path she had chosen would not allow for both. She had to choose between her faith and her love for him. The abbess gave her a choice: either seek forgiveness through penance or leave the convent and live in exile from the life she had known. Cecilia was torn, but deep down, she knew she had to make a decision. She left the abbess's office that day with a broken heart and no clear way forward. The fallout from Mark's affair was swift and merciless. Word of his infidelity spread through the town, and his professional life took a hit. Clients and colleagues who once respected him now looked at him with disdain. His reputation as a respected architect was tarnished, and many distanced themselves from him. At home, the tension with Claire reached its breaking point. She filed for separation, unable to live with the betrayal any longer. Mark begged her to reconsider, but Claire's resolve was firm. "You've made your choice, Mark," she said coldly. "You've chosen her over us, over everything we built." Mark's world crumbled. He was now alone, without the support of his wife, his colleagues, or the life he had once known. He began questioning everything: his marriage, his choices, and most painfully, his love for Cecilia. Had it been worth it? Was this the life he wanted? But despite the destruction, Mark couldn't erase the feelings he still had for Cecilia. His heart ached for her, but he knew they could never go back to what they had. In the aftermath of their choices, Mark and Cecilia met one last time in a secluded park outside the city. The air was heavy with unspoken words as they sat across from each other, the weight of their past actions hanging between them. "I'm so sorry, Cecilia," Mark said softly. "I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted any of this to happen." Cecilia looked away, her face pale and tired. "I know," she whispered, "but I've lost everything, Mark. My faith, my vows, my purpose. All because of a moment of weakness." Mark reached out to her, but she pulled back, her expression pained. "No," she said quietly. "We've crossed a line we can never come back from. It's over, Mark. We have to let each other go." The finality of her words crushed him. "I can't imagine my life without you," he admitted, his voice breaking. Cecilia stood, her body trembling. "You need to find your way back to your life. I need to find mine." And with that, she walked away from him, leaving Mark to face the consequences of his choices. Alone in the months that followed, both Mark and Cecilia struggled to rebuild their lives. Mark tried to reconnect with his estranged wife, but the damage had been done. He spent time in therapy, trying to understand what had gone wrong in his marriage and what he truly wanted from life. But he couldn't shake the regret he felt over his affair with Cecilia. Cecilia left the convent and moved to another city, seeking a fresh start. She found work at a local bookstore, but the ache of her lost love haunted her. She prayed daily, asking for forgiveness, but deep down, she couldn't help but wonder if she would ever find peace. Their paths would never cross again, but both carried the weight of their choices. The affair had shattered their lives, but had also given them a chance to reflect on their true desires and the paths they needed to take. It was a painful journey toward redemption, one neither could fully complete. But the lesson they both learned was clear. Actions have consequences, and love, when it's not true, can destroy everything in its wake. Time passed, and Mark slowly began to rebuild his career and life. Though the scars of his past never fully healed, he made amends with Claire. Though they never reconciled, she moved on and found a new purpose, but Mark's heart still ached for the life they had once shared. Cecilia, too, found some peace in her new life, though the longing for Mark never left her. She lived quietly, working in her bookstore and attending church on Sundays. She prayed for forgiveness, but had come to understand that some mistakes can never be fully erased. They were both different people now, shaped by their choices. The love they once shared had burned brightly, but it had also consumed them, leaving them with nothing but memories and regret. The affair had been their undoing, but it also marked a turning point in their lives, a lesson learned at a painful cost. Several years later, Mark and Cecilia's paths crossed once more, though they did not recognize each other at first. They both attended a church event in a small town, each living different lives. When they finally made eye contact, neither could bear to speak, knowing the pain that still lingered between them. Mark and Cecilia exchanged a brief, solemn glance before turning away. They had both moved on, but the memories of their affair, their love, and their heartbreak would forever remain a part of their past. It was a reminder that while life moves forward, some wounds never truly heal. The affair, once full of passion, was now a distant shadow, gone but never forgotten. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments. Have you experienced a love that changed your life? Like and subscribe for more stories exploring love, regret, and redemption. Join our community today